A few years ago, I moderated a debate where the resolution was the cyber war threat is greatly exaggerated. Actually, it wasn't a few years ago, it was about 10 years ago. And I'm not sure that we would be having that debate today. I think probably the question that we would be talking about is, are we organized to deal with cyber threats, or organized sufficiently, and why or why not? And I want to dive into a number of questions, but I want to start in that area. And I'll start with you, Pete. On the large issue that was just outlined by Gus, whether the many stakeholders in the cybersecurity field are on the same page with each other. Are they in touch with each other? Are they cooperating with each other in the way they need to be? Yes or no? And why or why not? So, and Pete, before you do that,
please
tell us who you are.
Certainly. Thank you. Hi. And I was going to get to that. My name is Pete Gouldmann, as I was introduced. The focus area I have in the State Department is trying to link the mission success or mission outcomes to the technology that supports it. This is an attempt to get our arms wrapped around the risk from a perspective of the whole of agency approach, and making sure that we're making wise decisions with our technology to be able to support that and achieve an acceptable degree of risk. To that point, I also want to point out that I have an internally facing function, and you're probably all very keenly aware that the State Department also has an externally facing function with cybersecurity. So when I speak about that, I'm giving you my personal opinion, not that of the agency. But I will say that cybersecurity is a very complex and multifaceted problem space, and I think that that generates a lot of different approaches to trying to solve the problem. I would often speak to people about there's more than one road to Egypt, so to speak, and you're still going to the same place. So it doesn't mean the path you're on is wrong. It just doesn't mean necessarily that it's well coordinated. And I think that was more than anything else the focus of Gus's comments, that by joining together in a common direction, we're stronger than we are by trying to tackle this problem individually and in individual paths.
And how are we doing at being in a common direction?
I think for government specifically, and Jeanette will probably be able to speak to this much better, we've unified quite well, around the Department of Homeland Security under the guidance of the Office of Management and Budget to take more of executive branch approach, as was outlined in the Executive Order 13800, that cyber is not an individual agency issue. It is a whole of government issue.
And David Mussington, you are now at the University of Maryland, but do we correctly understand you to be an academic, because you have public service, consulting, you've been in this field a long time? Tell us a little bit about your connection to this issue.
Well, right now I am an academic, a recovering academic. Just this morning I was teaching undergraduate students about how the federal government organizes itself for cyber policy and how that may not be in sync with what's required. Prior to that, I have some experience in both the think tank world and in the Department of Defense addressing cyber issues, so looking at those issues as the threat's gotten worse over the last decade.
And what about the question that David was grappling with? How are we at being coordinated on this? The many moving parts of the cybersecurity apparatus.
I guess I reframe the question a little bit and say that we have broad consistency of the way we coordinate on these issues across administrations. The question for me is whether what we coordinate on is actually converging on the threat or falling behind. And I just have a fairly strong opinion that we are falling behind.
Why?
Offensive advantages in cyberspace. Government policy doesn't move at the speed of the market, so that the vulnerability spectrum that we deal with in devices is just changing more rapidly than policy can really take account of. I do think that the current administration's cyber policies are creative and build on prior efforts that didn't go as far as this administration is trying to go. So a little bit of a quandary on whether governments are well organized for cyber risk management, but the current policies are moving in the right direction.
Okay, and Jeanette from Department of Homeland Security, describe your role there.
My name is Jeanette Manfra. I'm actually from the newest federal agency, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. Up until November 16th, when we were created by law, we were the National Protection and Programs Directorate. It's awful. And I was an assistant secretary for cybersecurity. And what we had worked for years is building an organization organization within the department that has broad responsibility, that is not regulatory, nor is it law enforcement, nor is it intelligence, but fills a gap that focuses on defense of the homeland against malicious cyber actors. And so after a very long, spanning multiple administrations process, Congress did finally pass a law to name the agency and stand us up. I'm here representing the cyber side. I have a colleague who's the Assistant Director for Infrastructure Security, focusing on physical threats to critical infrastructure. I will not bore you with the 23-year-long history, but really starting back in the Clinton administration and took off after 2001, the concept that the government and the private sector, more specifically critical infrastructure owners and operators, had to work together to counter threats to the homeland. And that's really where we were born from. A lot of counterterrorism focus in the early days, and as the cyber threat evolved, really kind of standing up my organization. I see us as having sort of three main roles that we focus on. And the first is on federal cybersecurity. And I'm going to lay this out both because not a lot of people understand it, but also because there's different answers to your question depending on what part of this you're talking about. So in federal cybersecurity, in one of President Trump's first executive orders, actually in May of 2017, was this 13800. And it built out this concept of what we're trying to do in federal cybersecurity, and more specifically the role of DHS. And I see some of your former government officials here, so you know very well that we use terms like .gov as if there's like one network that we're all using, and it's not true. There's 99 civilian agencies that are not in the DoD or in the IC that I'm responsible for assisting. They're all responsible for their own risk. That agency head is responsible for their own risk, and OPM made that quite clear to everybody that you will own that risk personally, and so there's and they maintain that by statute. They are responsible for that risk, but OPM also made clear that we have things like shared services.
For live stream people who are not specialists, can you tell them what OPM refers to?
I'm sorry, the Office of Personnel Management. This was the stealing of clearance applications as well as some other things. It was a major hack. It's probably the journalist way to put it.
It was a major hack.
And so. So we identified that while by statute it's important to preserve that, because just like in the private sector, the CEO is ultimately responsible for that risk that organization is undertaking and the risk decisions that they make. I don't run their network. I don't want to run their network. I can't make the decisions for them on what the risk is. But there was a place that was missing about understanding enterprise risk. Who is looking out for the entire civilian government, all those 99 agencies and thousands of networks and millions of devices that are hanging off of these networks. Who's sort of looking out for what that enterprise risk is? And that's where DHS really sort of is now positioned. Is we continue to offer services and capabilities, but it's where we're driving towards is understanding what's really important to the government. There's a tremendous amount of information that federal government, state and locals hold, and it's not just your application to get a clearance. It's every military-age male in the Selective Service. It is our census. It is our IRS information. There's a lot of information that the government holds that is attractive to adversaries. There are also functions that the government performs, whether that's an emergency or steady state, where we're providing services or functions to state and locals or to citizens or to residents or to travelers, that we need to ensure that those systems are hardened and resilient, and those would be also interesting to an adversary to disrupt the ability of the government to do those. So we're shifting our thinking away from more of what I think was a historical, traditional I'm just going to try to secure every single thing that's on my network, to let's understand what's really important to the mission, and then let's establish a high baseline for what we're going to do, and then DHS provides, and through CISA, our organization provides those services and capabilities to build that. That's where I think we've made a lot of improvement to your question about coordination and what we were talking about previously. We've come a long way in doing our sort of eating our own dog food within the federal government, and we're going to do a lot more in the next couple of years.
Okay, I want to come to Jim Condos in just a moment, but I want to, while you were speaking about the enterprise issue, Pete, you were nodding very vociferously. What were you thinking at that moment?
I just supporting the comment explicitly that an interesting aspect about information technology is that while we may not realize it, it underpins almost everything that we do. All aspects of what we accomplish, whether you're government or industry, it's very difficult to do without technology today, and that brings up a concern that takes it beyond just looking at the state of the technology itself and the threats to that technology. It's really an avenue of attack against the organization's operations. And so when we talk about that, we really begin to talk about the horizontal aspect of what it means for an organization to be able to conduct its mission, or if it's in the commercial space, to be able to conduct its business, and how disruption of that can occur through technology. And if we don't have a good understanding of that disruption in terms of the mission capability or the organization's operations, then we don't really have a good sense of where we should be spending or aligning our scarce human resources to attack the problem. And that's the enterprise view of security as opposed to the cyber-specific area. That's why my title is Enterprise Risk Officer for Cyber, because the view is from an enterprise perspective.
So Jim Condos is the Secretary of State of the state of Vermont and currently the President of the National Association of Secretaries of State. I've told people what you do, but what does what you do have to do with the issue of cybersecurity?
Well, I think that's, you know, as Pete just said, everything we do is tied to technology. And I can tell you that when we had the phone call in, what was it, August or September of 2016 with...
It was August 17th.
Thank you. You remember that well.
Just a little bit.
With Secretary Jay Johnson on the phone telling us that they had detected some attacks on our statewide, or actually local areas, and they were considering making us a critical infrastructure. We had no idea what that meant. That was kind of a wake-up call for, I think, the Secretaries of State across the country. I was fortunate in wearing my Vermont Secretary of State's hat. We had done a complete vulnerability and risk assessment back in 2013, not on just cyber but also on physical. And we actually had the third-party vendor that we used, who had a DoD clearance, to also rank high, medium, and low each of the risks that they might have found, or each of the risks that we should be looking at and be concerned about. They also tried to attach a dollar figure to those risks so we would know what we would be facing going forward. So we were ahead of the game. What we didn't know was whether we were one of the 21 states which were attacked, and actually there were 21 locales, and it took a while, but we finally, I think by June or so of 2017, we were started communicating much better with DHS, and it's not a knock. It's what was reality. We were wary. We were wary of federal overreach, and we didn't know what.
What were you wary of in terms of federal overreach?
Critical infrastructure. What does that mean? We thought it was going to be a takeover of our election systems, and it's clear. And
that really was the sense in conversation inside?
Yes. Yeah? Red states and blue states, we all felt the same, that that there may be an attempt to take over our election infrastructure overall.
And you were against that.
I even was against that, and you know, I later, as I had talked with Undersecretary Krebs, now CISA Director, or whatever, is it Director? Yeah. CISA Director Krebs, and Jeanette and I had spoken to Congress on a couple of occasions, but I think that the message that we came out of this whole thing from 2016 was communications. And today we have a much better communication system. We can get into more detail later, but the communications between federal, state, and local is much improved. The one thing that came out of there were 21 states that were attacked in 2016. With all due respect to the press, they focused on the one state that was breached. The rest of us, the other 20 states, were not. To us, that was the good news story. Those 20 states were not breached. They did their work. They defended, and they defended well. Right after 2018, November 6th, on November 7th, I was getting national press calls asking me, so what happened yesterday? And I said, no news is good news. And I think by 2018, we were in much better shape than we were prior to that. DHS, working with DHS, they provided many resources to us. I know our own systems, we go under a weekly cyber scan every week and get a report from DHS. We also have done penetration tests. We've done full vulnerability assessments, and we will continue to do that. We've started to reach out to our weak point, which we determined was our town clerks who access our management systems. So we put in immediately a multi-factor authentication to get in, including our own staff. And we also started to do webinars with our local folks to make sure that they understand the basics about cybersecurity and phishing techniques. So those are the things that we focus on.
Do you feel those are taking? I mean, are the town clerks open to that, or are they insulted by the suggestion that they need to be trained?
I think initially they felt like, why are you doing this to us? Some of them don't even want to turn on a computer. So let's be real. But you know, I think
it's a very secure way to handle it.
You know, the real fact here that we have to face up to is cybersecurity is a race without a finish line. It's the new normal. This is what we have to face up to each and every day. Just yesterday, my IT manager came in my office, and I said to him that asked him a question about something, and he said, "Well, don't worry, I've got it covered." And I says, "No, I do worry, and I need to know." It's just, you know, for us, we can't walk into Best Buy to buy a new vote tabulator and say, "I'll take 200 of those off the shelf." We have a process that we have to go through, and part of that includes cybersecurity.
Could I
Sure.
give it up? So, because I think like I was talking about where the Office of Personnel Management was a real wake-up call for the government and forced us to really think about things. Elections was also a wake-up call for us in your question about are we well organized and coordinated on the cyber threat. And, you know, we were very surprised by the reaction. But we're just like, what do you mean? We're nice. We're here to help. We just want to help you. Why don't you want to take our help? And we also sort of we're taking our sort of all of the historical bureaucracy that has been built up around things like prosecuting overseas wars and counterterrorism and all of these things, and trying to sort of apply it to cyber, and as if cyber is a space that actually exists, and what you're really talking about is, you know, a bunch of digital infrastructure and devices that everybody uses to create some effect, whether that's economic or a war or whatever. And so I think while I'm really proud of all the great work that I think the community and the government has done on elections in particular, it has also forced people to realize that it's not just about an attack against a computer or a phone. It's about nation states trying to undermine key critical functions of our democracies and things that they've been doing for years. But now they have new ways of doing this. And so how does the government respond to that? That's the question that we're working on.
David, you have sounded the strongest note of pessimism, I think, in the panel so far, in which you said you think we're behind and we're running to catch up, and we are behind, possibly even behind the bear, to mess up that metaphor completely. But where do you see the salient vulnerabilities?
Well, I think the salient vulnerabilities really flow from the continuing utility of older cyber weapons against us and older attack techniques. So denials of service still work, malware still works, phishing still works. We don't patch critical infrastructure to the extent that we should. I'll tell an old story. I used to, when I worked at Amtrak, I'll violate my rule and talk about that. I was chief of corporate security at Amtrak some years ago, and we used to ask some of our contractors about whether they had secured their Wi-Fi networks. And of course, they always assured us that they had, because everybody knows that you're supposed to secure communications that you provide to employees and for business functions. I later on worked in an inspector general's office and understood exactly what they meant by secured. They meant that they had written configuration lists of authorized devices and that their lists were up to date. So standard, when a consultant goes into an enterprise and looks for unauthorized code access points, you sort of have to turn down the sound from the number of detections you get, because practice differs from what's on paper. That's a continuing problem and has been since I sort of started working on this around the Y2K period a decade or more ago. Equally, the threat is worse. Not only do nation states have capabilities, but those capabilities are migrating downward through black and gray markets to criminals. And so we have phenomena like ransomware, where techniques that were previously believed to be only available to nation states are now being used by criminals with financial impact that's global in footprint. That's a fairly recent phenomenon, and that's after we've spent a decade or more and a lot of money trying to remediate enterprise risks. So
is there a direct diagnosis of the problem?
Diagnosis
of why all this is? Why we're so far behind?
Well, in the trade, I'm sure as Jeanette would probably, people talk about offense dominance. Attack is easier than defense. And that the attackers realize that and don't need to use their best techniques to break the levels of vulnerability we have in society. So in an environment where attack tools are purchasable, and where there is variation in the levels of protection in critical infrastructures, people can be exploited, and that is actually what is happening.
Pete, in all of this, has there been a greater need for both political will and public concern that has been missing? In other words, there has been no Cyber 9/11, thank goodness. Most people get through their daily lives without thinking about this, so not a lot of political pressure from voters on politicians, and yet the Russian hack comes along and suddenly very much raises the profile of the challenge. And I'm wondering, number one, in a sense, has the Russian hack has a silver lining in that it's put a focus on this thing, and do we need more focus of that nature?
I think that what we deal with in the cyberspace is a crisis of confidence. There's a need to understand what's really going on, but there's an equally powerful push against sharing what's going on. Because as you share, there's a sense that you're weak or vulnerable or not exercising due care, and therefore you shouldn't be a trusted entity to do business with. And that's a very powerful perspective, because it's a case of, is it really true or is it just a consequence of events? And so I think that part of the struggle, and I've seen this over many years now, a number of events. We mentioned OPM, Target, Sony, it goes on, Equifax. The general public is becoming more aware that this is happening. Whether the new norm seems to be moving in the direction of sharing early and often when we find something out, maybe not all the information, but something isn't necessarily right. And as the general populace becomes more aware of this, and it has to move beyond my bank mailed me a new piece of plastic, right? It has to be something a little more tangible to motivate the masses to say, this is something we need to collectively solve. And I this is, of course, my viewpoint, my opinion, but there was some talk, I think, early on the white paper that Gus mentioned. Some years ago, I said that, when the nation decided they wanted to go to the moon, they got there. If the nation decided it wanted to solve a cyber problem, we'd get there. I really have no doubt of that, because I think our resolve is that strong when we choose to do so. But at the moment, there isn't a critical mass of need that's been generated that's universal. And
also, I think you're saying there are also disincentives for private enterprise to share what's going on and probably to cooperate. I mean, if the Secretary of State of Vermont was suspicious of the federal government coming up to help out with election problems,
right.
A private business is almost certainly going to be even more suspicious or fearful. I mean, I throw that out to all of you. What do you do about that?
Go ahead.
So we spend a lot of time on this because, we have, unlike on the federal government where we can direct actions and sort of take more prescriptive approach, so we use that rarely. On the non-federal government, it is completely voluntary. And that means we have to provide value for people to want to work with us. And again, we learned a lot with the elections. We've learned a lot with in partnerships with the financial sector, with the energy sector. And so what we have, there's been a lot of talk for years and years. People keep using the term information sharing, which I hope we ban at some point because it just doesn't mean anything anymore. And really what we need to get to is, what is the role of government in managing this risk? And there is a lot of different parts of government that have a role, and it's not sort of one thing that one organization can take on. Regulators have a role. Law enforcement has a role. Everybody has a role. But what we realized, again, what was missing is understanding critical functions in the country. Whether those are elections, whether that's the generation of electricity, whether that's transacting high-value payments in the financial sector, clean water, these sorts of things, right? We take for granted, but many of them are already digitally dependent or are on their way to doing that. So if you have a nation-state adversary, not somebody who's trying to make money, but somebody who's interested in disrupting these functions, we'd like to have some awareness of what those functions are. I don't think the government understands those well enough. So we've started a conversation with industry about what do those functions actually look like. We're going to publish a list of national critical functions soon. But then what does it mean? The government is in a good position to provide things like early warning, to build contingency plans for how we react as a country to an incident, to keep it from having catastrophic consequences, have those plans in place ahead of time. We are in a good place, I think, to bring people together in a safe environment that is not regulatory and is not for the purposes of a collection intelligence, though we do want to inform that. And so that's where we sit, and we bring folks in and we say, let's not talk about what specific vulnerability you've got or, what you have done or not done wrong. And let's talk about your role in providing for these critical functions. And how do we work together to combine our resources and our capabilities to both deter the actors from having that access, so raise the defenses of those systems, but also position each other in a space where we can provide early warning and we can respond, because it's not going to be a traditional sort of response or early warning. So I think it's narrowing down what the government is actually going to do, not just tell me everything that you've done wrong, and maybe we'll do something about it. Because I do think that there has to be a reason for whether, and I want companies to be concerned about their shareholder value. That's the point of why they exist. So there has to be sort of a compelling reason for them of why have this participation. And I think it's narrowing down what we're focused on. It's looking at the specific types of data that is helpful to us to build this capability, and then it's building trust in the system that we've worked on. But you need to build a lot of trust to be able to share this information. It means the government has to be more open as well in the stuff, not just sort of say, well, it's classified, or, well, I can't share this with you for whatever reason. We have to similarly be open with them.
Go ahead, Jim. Just before you speak, okay. I just want to say I'd like to go to questions in a couple of moments and have you become part of the conversation. And the way that will work is just raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. But let's hear from Jim.
So, one of the things that I think we've really worked to create is a communication system.
Your mic up just a little closer.
We've worked to create a communication system that really is beneficial to all. And one of the things that we've done, for instance, we have the Election Infrastructure Information Sharing Analysis Center. It was according to DHS, Jeanette's here, she can confirm it. It was the fastest setup of a ISAC in their history. We have all 50 states. We have over 1,400 county and local governments that are members of it. And essentially every week we receive a briefing, if you want to call it, from the ISAC that tells us what occurred in the last week, if there is anything that's out there. And it'll be rated as white, meaning low priority, to what is it, red for?
Well, that's the information sharing.
Okay. So in any case, you know, I mean, and I go back to we're working with other partners besides the Department of Homeland Security. We work with the Harvard Belfer Center on tabletop exercises for states. We work with the Center for Internet Security through DHS. Every state has Albert monitors. They're monitors that are that track incoming traffic, IP addresses, and in real time goes back to their headquarters, and they review it and can let us know if they suspect that there's an attack going on. So there's a lot of stuff that was not available to us prior to 2016 that today is available. August 24th, 2018, my IT manager came to me and he said, he hands me a couple of sheets of paper and he says, this came off of our WAF, our web application firewall, and he goes, point the country of origin, two contacts, Russia. He said, what do you want to do with it? And I said, well, you call CIS, Center for Internet Security, I'm going to call DHS and let them know. And I think it was within 24 hours, once they found a couple of other entries of the same IP addresses elsewhere in the country, they put out a mass call to all states to let them know that this was out there, be aware of it. We don't know if it was going to be nefarious or not, but we certainly had our suspicions. But in any case, the good news, as I said in November, no news is good news. We didn't have any breaches that we saw or anything out of the ordinary. Please understand that every state, every business, everybody is getting scanned every day, thousands, if not tens of thousands of times. It's almost mind-boggling to understand how much, and some of this is automated through bots and whatever, and I'm not an expert, but it really is kind of scary at times to see what is going on out there. What we can do, the bad guys, they're going to try what they tried yesterday to get into our systems. If they couldn't get in, they'll come back again today with a different way. And if they can't get in today, they're going to come back tomorrow, and they'll keep going until they can try to get into the system more. It's just something that we all have to face up to, that we have to put the systems in place, the defenses in place, and literally be confident that we've done what we can, but can't sit back on it. We have to continue to evolve because they are.
Okay, let me just jump in. Will any questions be coming from the audience? Okay, I want to continue on that. I might have missed one. Okay, I'll come to it in just a second, then, if you could stand by. I just have a question for Jeanette, because the news has made your appearance here a lot more interesting than it was promised to be at the beginning. Well, the shuffle at the top of your department. The question, I mean, I think basically the question is, are the professionals going to be able to just keep doing their jobs, or is the politics making things difficult?
I would say the professionals can do their job.
And is the politics going to make things difficult? Is it making things difficult?
Professionals will keep doing their job regardless of the politics.
Anybody else on, just let's put it this way, how this whole issue is being impacted, affected, improved, made better, stronger as a result of leadership from the White House?
I've publicly stated in the past that it concerned me and many of the secretaries. This is not NAS president speaking. This is Vermont Secretary of State. But what concerns me is that we had 17 intelligence agencies saying the Russians did it or tried to do it. And the person at the top is still not convinced. I know that he's put in place some executive orders to get things moving. But it does trouble me that.
But am I incorrect that there was task force? There were two task forces formed under your department to investigate the Russia issue, and that has been somewhat downsized.
No.
Not downsized. Okay.
No. So the two task forces, I assume you're talking about the elections task force and the countering foreign influence, they were actually merged into one. So we have election initiative sort of group overall. We really did, and thank you for the opportunity to clarify this actually, what we did actually was we transitioned from a task force model, which was very much meant to be how do we get from starting in the beginning of the administration with 2017 to where we need to be for the midterms, to more institutionalizing it across the entire organization. So it remains one of our top 5 priorities for CISA. We still have a group of people that are 100% dedicated to it. As we build up towards in particular 2020 elections, there's other special elections that we do help out with, but we will continue to expand that. Congress has given us some additional money. So I think there was some sort of interpretation of what was really just a bureaucratic kind of move into actually making it more of an institutional part of the organization.
So there was a question forming over here.
Hello, I'm Richard Baitlick from Corelight. I wanted to ask a question about the cloud. I work at a startup, and everything we do is in the cloud. And in fact, it would be much more expensive if we had to build everything ourselves. Even though we're security people, we understand this stuff, we realize that the people at AWS, the people at Google, they can all do it tons better and much cheaper. So I'm wondering, each of you come from an organization that has a network and an environment and all that. How willing are you to perhaps address some of these personnel problems, skills problems, et cetera, by putting your stuff in a cloud?
David, do you have thoughts on that?
Just first, before I respond, I'd like to respond to the last question you posed relative to national policy. I think that it's important to keep our eye on the ball here, and the ball is all critical infrastructures, even though the election infrastructure was assaulted. And I think that threats against critical infrastructures are still here, and DHS and other agencies are doing their darndest to try and coordinate federal and state and critical infrastructure counter responses. I do also think that the consensus in the intelligence community is mirrored internationally by our friends and allies, and that creates a coalition of the willing that, in a sense, immunizes the efforts from vagaries of temporary politics sometimes. I know because we live in Washington, we think that everything rises and falls depending on the Washington Post headline, but that actually isn't true in this issue. With regard to cloud and its security and cost advantages, it strikes me that there are many potential shortcuts for enterprise cyber risk management. One might be hiring people who are really good at it and have the economics right. And I think critical infrastructures are looking at cloud alternatives as ways to accelerate their progress in cyber risk management from the elections infrastructure on down. And I think that's a good development.
Pete?
I'd like to add on top of that while you can solve many problems with cloud infrastructure, the risk remains with you. And one of the most important lessons of employing cloud service provisions is that you have a job to work with them to create an acceptable operating environment. They're going to do what they're contracted for. They're going to do what they've said they can step up to. And as said, they have the economic balance in their favor to have the talent necessary to do that. But you have to meet them along the journey. Cloud provision of identity access, you can subscribe to that as a service, but if you're going to other services like doing Salesforce or ServiceNow, or whether it's Microsoft, Google, or Amazon, the expectation is that you're vetting your users that are accessing that cloud, and that puts that onus back on you. So it's actually more of a collaborative engagement than it is a transfer of operations.
So we've moved most of our stuff to the cloud. We've got just a little bit left. We've gotten away from physical servers. When I said earlier that we did in 2013 both a physical and a cyber, one of the things that was brought to our attention was we needed to make sure that our physical servers at that time were also secure, not just in a room somewhere, that we had actually secured that area. But every time we put an IT project in place, one of the components of our contract with the vendor is cybersecurity, and some of that we have a contract obviously with AWS, and we will continue to work towards ensuring, pushing the buttons to make sure that the cloud protection is there. But we're also working with the Center for Internet Security on a pilot to develop an Albert monitor that works in the cloud. But that also requires AWS to be involved.
I would just say so a key administration initiative is IT modernization. Cloud is a big part of that. We call it Cloud Smart, even have stickers. What we're experiencing is that, kind of echoing what we previously talked about, is this is just another round of IT managers thinking that they can outsource their risk to somebody else. In this case, it's the cloud provider. And so we're working to help educate people. People use the term cloud as if it's, again, it's like one thing. It's like, are you talking about your applications? Are you talking about your infrastructure? What are you doing? We've got a lot of very small and medium-sized agencies that are ripe for cloud deployments and are sort of eagerly, and frankly, some of the leaders in the government on some of that adoption. But we have to make sure that all of the pieces that we've put in place to collect data for, sort of internet traffic in and out of agencies and to understand what those sensors look like. We have to migrate that to the cloud. We also want to make sure that they're doing it in a smart way. They're writing the contracts correctly. They understand who the security operator is. Every provider has a different way of doing it. And then the government and state and locals to also have these unique requirements for some of the data that they need to see, which is a little bit challenging in some of the big cloud offerings. But we're working through all of that. We're big believers that cloud can solve a lot of our efficiency and resource challenges for certain cases, not for everything. And so it's, but there's, OMB has issued a fair amount around the Cloud Smart strategy in some of this.
And Jeanette, you got the last word with that. And I want to mention, by the way, that you had to move your schedule because of our schedule change, and you flew here. I want to thank you for that. And Jim Condos, you literally flew here in an airplane. You woke up this morning in a town where it was 23 degrees. So I hope you enjoy the weather. And to Pete and David, thank you as well. Thanks to all of you. And we're going to be switching panels now, but please, a round of applause.